turn the volume on.
Do you let the public know we deferred till 4:10?
Yeah, we're just gonna. I know she can just double check that.
Hi,
monitors
I'm
on
Meeting
the-
Owl. To get started, download the
Just double
Meeting
check
Owl
that
app on your
thing.
phone.
No, I don't see the auditors, and they will show up in 2 minutes. Hey Rick, sorry, we're still waiting for the auditors. We're just sending my email just to send them the links again, or.
Oh, fresh air. Okay, thank you. It's just beautiful up there.
Isn't it?
Hey Mo, do we have our presenters available when we get there?
What I'm thinking,
Oh,
Rick,
you're on mute. Or at least I can't hear you.
No, we're unmute.
In fact, I can't hear anybody.
Oh, the owl is just reconnecting. Should be, the owl just reconnected. Can you hear us now?
I can hear everyone.
Awesome.
Rick,
Okay,
can you
Rick,
hear?
so what I'm thinking is I email the auditors again, just reminding them that we're starting the meeting. So what we should do probably is if we could start the meeting, and then I could probably discuss policy 704 accumulated operating surplus. And then by then we should have the auditors joining us.
Perfect. I heard most of that. It turns out that I had my volume turned off, which is why I couldn't hear anybody. Not all that surprising, but my apologies. So I want to begin this I want to call this Finance Committee meeting to order and begin by acknowledging that we are privileged to meet on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish and St'át'imc Nations. And I'm not aware of any changes to the agenda. So if we could have a motion to approve the agenda.
That the agenda of this meeting be approved.
Thank you. Seconded by? Thank
Rebecca?
you. Okay, Cynthia's hand went up and I saw it. So Cynthia has seconded. Any discussion on the agenda? And all in favor, and if any opposed, please speak up. Okay, that's carried, no opposed. And we have one set of minutes to adopt. Anybody going to get tired of the awkward silence?
I can do that. That the minutes of the Finance Committee meeting held on May 12th, 2021 be adopted.
Thank you. Seconder for that.
Ian,
Thank you, Ian. Any discussion on the minutes? All in favor? Any opposed? Speak up. Thank you. That's carried. And that takes us down to the presentations, but did you want to skip over that first, Mo, and go to the operating surplus?
No, we're good. The auditors are on.
Okay, great. In that case, it's my pleasure to welcome them here.
Hi everyone, it's Nolan Molyneux from Grant Thornton. Donna Discos is the partner on the engagement. I believe she's still trying to join at the moment.
Okay. Well, it's nice to see you, Nolan, and thank you for coming and attending this meeting.
Yep, I'm glad to join. Would you like me to get started? I'm assuming she'll join shortly.
Yeah, you go right ahead. It's your call. You guys are making the presentation. Whatever's going to work for you will work for us.
Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen to show the report. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Let me know once you can see it. Oh, wait, it says host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
You're good, Nolan?
Oh, there you go. Let me know if you can see it.
Thumbs up.
Perfect. So we'll get started. So the purpose of the report is to go through our planned audit approach. We don't want it to be a presentation as much as a discussion. We do want your input on whether you're in agreement with it or if you have any additional thoughts to give on it. So with that, I'll hop right in though. The first point there being the status of our audit plan. So as part of us being the new auditor this year, the first step was for us to review the predecessor auditor file. So we've done that. The predecessor auditor obviously was the Office of the Auditor General. We got in contact with them and I was able to review their work remotely. And in terms of from an audit perspective, what we needed to get, we got everything we needed, which was great. Otherwise, we had our in charge that's going to be on the engagement, Nicole Wall, as well as the assistant accountant, and Chang helping out with the planning work about 2 weeks ago or so. And we got a large chunk of information from management that we've been mostly gone through, but not everything. So we've done the majority of our.
Nolan, I'm sorry to break in. I'm just going to interrupt and ask whether, is it possible for you to magnify the image so that our public that is on YouTube will be able to see it a little bit more clearly? Is
that better?
I think it is. Yep. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption.
No problem. So we've done the majority of our planning work, but haven't finished it yet. So this is, I want to say, our planned audit strategy based on that, these preliminary assumptions. If there's any significant changes that we identify as we wrap up planning, we would let management and then the committee know as well. All right, so I'm going to hop into the first aspect of the report, which is COVID-19's impact. So due to the distance of the school district's office, as well as the potential for COVID-19 to still be an ongoing issue come the year-end fieldwork, things are looking up, thankfully, so hopefully it won't be an ongoing issue, but just in case. We're planning to do the majority of our audit work remotely. So in order to do so, we would utilize a combination of phone calls, video conferencing, regular email, and then also some file sharing platforms. We've had over a year of performing audits, majority virtual at this point. And in the end, we've been able to perform the same procedures we would have performed in person, as well as vouch down to the same supporting documentation. So to the extent the school district's all right with that approach, we think it'll work well. And we haven't had any significant issues in the past. We have noted that with some clients, there is some information where we recognize it can be extra cumbersome to either provide electronically, either it's like a large paper-based document that has to be scanned in or something. And if that's the case, we usually just kind of pull that information or pull those items up throughout the audit. And then near the end of the actual audit engagement itself, we'd plan a short time to come out in person and go through them, which has usually worked out. Otherwise, in terms of internal controls, just because of COVID-19, a lot of people hadn't been going into work for a certain period of time. Some organizations let people work virtually the entire time. And some organizations just had, I want to say, individual aspects of their employees' daily processing changed from something that was done physically in person to something that began being done virtually. So what we would end up doing is just double checking with management the extent that COVID-19 has caused a change in control processing. And from there, if we think it would end up impacting our audit itself, we would alter our procedures as necessary. From our preliminary discussions with management, it didn't seem like there was anything that would have changed year over year that we think would have a significant impact. But as we wrap up our audit plan, we'll confirm that's the case. Are there any questions there before I continue on to the next page? No? Okay. The next piece here is impairment. So just due to the significance of COVID, from an audit perspective, we're required to put the assets in place as at year end for the school district under extra scrutiny. So if there's any expected changes in future use because of COVID, we would have those discussions with management to figure out if there's any potential impairment considerations that should be made. And to the extent there are, we'd have further discussions with them and analysis to try and figure out the actual dollar amount associated with it. I know some school districts in the summer, because they have less school-related activities going on, they would typically rent out some of their space to like camps and programs, and COVID caused a change in that. So like we'd have those discussions to figure out whether if any of it has any sort of potential, I want to say, longer lasting impact once presumably, or hopefully, COVID's less of an issue a year from now. Otherwise, there's a few general items we would take into consideration because of COVID. The first being some of the programs that school districts typically administer throughout the year may have changed in their approach and how they're provided. So we would have discussions with management to figure out whether the actual revenue recognition patterns that are typically in place, whether they, like the ones they would have used in previous years, whether it actually makes sense to still apply them the same way in the current year. And if there's anywhere where we think that might not be the case, we would do a further analysis to figure out whether the actual dollar amount being recognized should change. And then otherwise, the employee future benefits requires a number of assumptions from an actuary. And just due to COVID-19, there is, I want to say, a bit more volatility in some of those assumptions than what typically, or what it typically would be like in a regular year. So we would look at the assumptions used by the actuaries, specifically in relation to employee future benefits, which is reported on the school district's financial statements, to the extent it might impact that dollar figure. Otherwise, for the federal and provincial COVID-19 related funding received, if there's significant dollar amounts as part of that, we would vouch to the agreements themselves to look at the restrictions in place. We would have discussions with management to figure out how they're making sure the use of those funds are following those restrictions. And then to the extent there actually are expenses incurred against that funding, we would then vouch a sample of them to make sure that the expenses themselves are appropriately being utilized by the or recognized under the agreement. The next piece there is the personal protective equipment. So this is a little bit of a weird one, but we have to consider it. So to the extent that the school district was possibly stockpiling personal protective equipment like masks or gloves or even like hand sanitizer stuff that you would normally expense, if there's a large amount of those items as at year end, consideration should be given as to whether it actually should be recorded as inventory instead of expense. We doubt this would end up being a material item, but nonetheless, it's like a unique item because of COVID. So we figured we'd have those discussions. Does anybody think that would actually be the case for the school district this year? I'm not sure if like the stockpiling of PPE has been apparent for it throughout the year.
No, and I think we've been pretty good when it comes to ordering just in time and stuff like that. But we'll let you know if closer to year end that's an issue. But in reality, you know, our cleaning regimens are pretty head on there when it comes to standards and stuff like that. So we do it on a daily basis. So hopefully it's not going to be the case, but we'll absolutely let you know at year end when we're doing our inventory and looking at things like that.
Okay, sounds good. The last COVID-19 piece there is just a disclosure. So obviously it had an impact on how some of the school services were administered throughout the year and the program. So we recommend management include some sort of disclosure to describe that potential impact. There would have been wording that the OAG would have included in last year's financials, as well as recommended wording we can discuss with management for this year's financials. That's it for the COVID-19 implications. Does anyone have any questions before I continue to the next page? Oh, okay. Moving on, the next piece we'll talk about is materiality. So we use materiality as a guiding threshold of the items on the financial statements that we want to subject to testing. And then for the items that we do want to test, we use it as to help determine the extent of the testing we performed. So to determine materiality, we would consider a number of different quantitative and qualitative factors. And from there and our planning work performed, we determined our preliminary materiality to be $2 million. Come year end, once we get the year end financial information, we would then relook at materiality to see whether that preliminary assessment makes sense to change or update. Are there any questions anybody had about that? Well, sorry, one thing I should mention too is like, we don't look at, it's not like we ignore items under $2 million. We have a performance materiality we use as well as we do sampling throughout the file. Okay, if there's no questions there, I'll move on to the next piece.
Yep.
In terms of the uses of experts, just because there's the employee future benefits and an actuary is involved in determining the dollar amount associated with them, we look at the reports that the actuary generates, and we actually have to do some audit work on whether the assumptions are appropriate, especially in light of COVID, because there is a bit more volatility and sensitivity around those items now. Continuing on, so because the school district's financial statements roll up into the province and the Office of the Auditor General is the auditor of the province itself, we're technically component auditors and we're part of their group audit. So as part of that, we're going to have to, I want to say, provide them reports of the results of our audit. So just a heads up that like we'll be corresponding with them to make sure that happens in a timely manner. What it means for you is basically that we're going to send them the financial statements as well as a document that tells us to list out whether there was any sort of unadjusted misstatements or significant control findings, stuff like that. It'd be in line with the type of information we generally would report back to this committee at the end of the audit. All right, moving on. So as part of the audit, we do look at whether there's compliance with laws or regulations, as well as there's any instances of fraud. We don't test every single balance or judgment or transaction or assumption that flows through to the financial statements. So an audit isn't a guarantee that there's no fraud happening. But we do specific procedures around where we think there's heightened risk of fraud. And if we find any fraud, no matter the dollar threshold, we would report it to the committee. As well as with that, we are required by the auditing standards to ask those charged with governance, which would be this group, whether they're actually aware of any fraud, as well as if they think there's any sort of heightened areas that are harder to oversee in regards to fraud. So I'd like to open the discussion up now to the rest of the group.
I'm not aware of any fraud.
That's a good answer.
In the past, are there any particular areas that they've noticed where people in a governance role should be more sensitive to the potential for fraud? Are there, like, do you know what I
For
mean?
school districts,
Yeah.
for school districts, it's usually not a material risk, but there is a heightened risk around school-generated funds just because it's harder to have oversight over them. Like the individual schools obviously don't have the same robust controls that the head office would. So that's one area. Otherwise, I don't think there's a huge, I want to say, financial reporting fraud risk. Like usually, I'd say most of the risk relates to potential theft of assets or cash. And the school-generated funds would be the hardest one to oversee in that regard.
Okay, thanks for
And
that.
Nolan, if I may just add, obviously technology safety in terms of our firewalls and protection of access into our systems is something that school districts didn't used to have a lot of attention on, and now that access through those windows remotely is a really big deal. So we spend a fair bit of money on tech staff and team and security for those reasons.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Can I just add on? So like we'll probably do this later unless I missed it, but there's two key components that the audit is going to, right? So the first of them is The plan is that our auditors are also going to randomly select one or two schools and evaluate their school generated funds, and essentially from a sample basis assess whether or not there's a likelihood for fraud based on those two schools or whatever, for all of our other schools. And then the number two component, and we've put this as part of our requirements with auditors, is also evaluating our internal controls when it comes to information technology and keeping up that service that the Office of the Auditor General typically did when it comes to evaluating those internal controls and making some recommendations based on them if they see there's any weaknesses there. So it's something, and Nolan, you'll probably touch on those a little bit later on during your presentation, right? It's two components.
Yeah, so like we don't do a test of controls for the IT side of things, but as part of our the audit, we do have to get an understanding of the IT environment and the controls in place. So it's not like we're gonna like try to penetrate your system 25 times or something, but we do have conversations and talk with the IT staff to figure out what controls are in place. And if there's any gaps we notice, we would bring it to your attention.
So I would say, sorry, it's Donna, I'm on now. I'm sorry, had some technological problems. But I would say it is looking at those things, both the school generated funds and the IT systems as part of the financial statement audit, but it's not doing like a specific deep dive into IT controls. So I just want to make sure that it's not an IT review in that sense. If that makes sense.
Are we all right to move on? Do you want to have more discussion around that side of things?
I think just in terms of fraud risks as well, I think one of the key things is looking at segregation of duties. And like if one person has the ability to initiate a transaction and approve a transaction and can benefit from the transaction, that's also a fraud risk. So that is something as well that we consider during the audit process, is just the segregation of duties that are in place.
Sorry, Rick, I think you're muted.
That explains why when I welcomed Donna, she didn't say anything. Welcome to the meeting, Donna.
Thank you.
Wouldn't be the first time today or other days that I yacked on with my mute on.
Sorry.
No.
First, so I have, yeah.
So let me ask the board, are there any other questions or comments on that topic, or shall we move on?
Move on.
Okay.
I will flip it over to Donna now that she's online. I've done enough.
Well, thanks, Noel. You were doing a great job. So I don't want to interrupt you. Just a couple of things. I'm not sure to the extent that you may have discussed this with the Auditor General last year, but there are a couple of one new auditing standard that's in place this year, and one new accounting standard that's going to be in place in future years that could have a significant impact on the school district. In terms of the auditing standard, it's related to looking at auditing estimates. So where there is a significant estimate that the school district might, and many of you might think accounting is black and white, it's not. It's like there's lots of gray areas and lots of areas where estimates have to be made. Kind of one of the things that we have to do as auditors now is really consider management's processes around those estimates, and also do a kind of a look back test to see when management did estimate something in the past, how close were they to coming up with the actuals. So that's just something that would be different from slightly different from what may have been in place in the past. And so we will incorporate that as part of the audit. So that's applicable for the current year audit. The new accounting standards that we've pointed out here, and it's just really to put on your radar in terms of asset retirement obligations, is something that's not going to be in place for the current year, but that's something that needs to be implemented in the next couple of years, is really looking at where you might have a future obligation. And for school districts, the biggest area might be with respect to buildings that could potentially contain asbestos, and where you might have to remediate the properties. And there are special accounting rules that are coming into place with respect to looking at the future cash flows related to that remediation and recording an adjustment to put that on the balance sheet. And so that is something that the Ministry of Education, I think, has reached out to the school districts. I think, Mo, you may have provided some preliminary information to the ministry on that, but that's something, hopefully, we're hoping with some guidance from the ministry in terms of templates and other guidance, there will be a significant amount of work that goes into coming up with those cash flows and coming up with the liability that has to be recorded in the financial statement. So that's just putting that on the radar, not for the current year, but for future years. I don't know if there's any questions on that piece. I don't know if Mo, you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, so just, I've been planning this over the months and even last year, when it comes to just making sure our accounting staff is trained in this. So it's right there, it's written on my whiteboard, ARO. And basically one of the things that I've kind of approved from just a CFO standpoint is if we don't have the resources as a staff to kind of come up with a complex methodology and how we're going to recognize the asset retirement obligation and basically the cumulative impact it may have on our budgets when it comes to setting aside appropriate contingency reserves, et cetera, and schedules. I've just put down that we're okay with retaining a consultant to help us kind of set everything up because it might be pretty complex. And then another thing I'm pushing, going obviously into the third biggest school district in this province with also and with BC ASBO is BC ASBO taking more of a lead on having resources available for smaller school districts. So so everyone is sharing their best practices in doing this, because ultimately it's something where it's going to be a system-wide impact. And it's one of the things I did it from, you guys can speak on this too, but it's one of the things that we actively had kind of conversations about. Well, if we needed your advice on, okay, best practices, or we wanted to kind of show you guys our schedules and all that stuff and controls that we've come up with for this. And it's something that you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, we're open to when it comes to just validation or just feedback and helping us with that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're certainly happy to help critique, look at your calculations, look at provide guidance on the accounting. I think we even have some webinars on how just the general concepts. But I think I have some clients that, previously had already set these up. And it is significant internal effort just to get the information on the cash flows. Sometimes you won't be able to do that on your own. You'll need to retain kind of capital consultants to estimate how much remediation would cost. And so it is just putting on the radar. It is significant effort. You're not going to be able to just come up with a number overnight. It's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
So just to talk, but we're happy to help along the process in terms of just critiquing and providing guidance on kind of next steps. So
Just before we move on, can I just ask one quick question? Can you tell me the name of the other new rule that's being implemented? The one was the asset retirement budget, and what was the other one?
There was one that was an auditing one, which was CAS 540, which was related to auditing estimates.
Can you tell me?
And then the other accounting change was related to asset retirement obligations.
What was the first one you said?
It was called CAS 540.
Okay.
Auditing estimates.
Okay, thank you so much.
So if you can flip to that next page. So part of what we do in the audit process is look at kind of where we think that there are significant risks and how we plan to address those risks in audit testing. And so what I like to call this page kind of our audit on a page, and kind of that doesn't mean that we're not auditing other areas, but sort of these are the key areas that we wanted to highlight. And so from a, not sure how much detail you want us to go in, sort of what we, and this is pretty similar to other school districts, I think where we see the risks from first of all, is from a revenue recognition perspective, not in terms of kind of your main operating grant from the ministry, but in terms of specific funding that you might get for specific purposes, and making sure that if there's expenses that sort of match that funding, that's accounted for appropriately. And so specifically looking at the special purpose funds and looking at the revenue recognition related to those special purpose funds. So that's one area. Segregation of duties is another area that I've talked about just in terms of fraud risks, and looking at specific procedures to address those risks. Looking at, we'll look at your processes and how things are, who can do what. And also one of the tests that we do is a test of journal entries, because that is typically an area where there is an increased risk of fraud. So we'll look at that. The other areas that we've identified here, just in terms of significant volume of transactions, employee compensation being your single biggest expense. And so we are in the process of looking at your processes and how you do things, and understanding payroll processes, and then looking at sort of understanding from the Auditor General's files, sort of the approach that they took to auditing employee compensation, and designing what procedures we might want to do in terms of testing payroll. So we'll look at that. And then the last item that we've highlighted here is just on capital assets, another significant area of expenditures, and just at what's been capitalized, what funding have you received, and are you doing it in accordance with the guidance issued by Treasury Board and the Ministry. So those are kind of four key areas that we wanted to highlight. As Mo had said, we're also, we didn't highlight it here. It's not a larger dollar volume item, but just because of the significant fraud risk related to school generated funds, we do design procedures around the school generated funds and test a sample of transactions in those funds to make sure that any risks are being addressed there. And as Mo said, because especially for employee compensation, because it's highly computerized, we do need to look at kind of access controls and other things around the IT system to make sure that there's no kind of material weaknesses that exist in the IT environment. One of the things, just, I don't know if this is relevant, but just from an IT perspective, I know that cybersecurity has been a hot topic, especially in this COVID world, and you've talked about kind of access to your systems. I think what we found is that a lot of those cybersecurity risks relate to phishing scams and just people getting into your systems through employees letting them in unintentionally. So I think what we found is just education is a really important way to help address some of those cybersecurity risks. I think in terms of the next piece, I think our proposed fees are in accordance with the RFP, so there's not to talk about there, but in terms of team timing and communications, which is the next page, it just sets out the audit timeline. And so one of the things we wanted to point out in terms of the performance of fieldwork that had been preliminary set for August 3rd to 13th. I think in discussions with management, it makes more sense to start a little bit later just so that management can be more prepared with the adjustments and process all the adjustments before we start the audit. So we will be starting a week later, so the August 9th, which I think is similar to what the start date has been in prior years. And that's working towards, I believe the board meeting to approve the statements, if I'm correct, is September the 8th. And so we're working in that timeline to, start in early August and then be able to provide the statements for the board approval on September 8th. I know in there, one of the challenges is the transition of a secretary treasurer. So we will work to make sure that we get all the information that we need before that transition happens. I don't know if you wanted to talk about any more on the timeline.
No, I think, yeah, I think you already touched on the August 9th is the actual kind of start date. It's aligned with our staff being ready. Yeah, that's good. We'll make sure the transition happens smoothly.
And realizing that it is a period of transition, certainly to the extent that you would need us to help in any way in terms of getting things done, we're certainly able to help or to provide some guidance if there's additional guidance that's needed. So just happy to help. We just provided and as part of our report, not part of the audit, we do publish some thought leadership regularly. So we have provided some links to some thought leadership that we've published. I think Nolan has a library of lots of other thought leadership that he's kept track of. So if there's anything, if there's a particular area where you do need some additional guidance, it's entirely likely that we have some guidance on it. So just reach out if there's anything that's of interest to you. I think one of the things that we haven't listed on here that we do have available is that some people find very useful is an audit committee kind of handbook, and sort of it spells out kind of roles and responsibilities and other things related to audit committees. So happy to provide that as well if you think that would be useful.
Rick, may I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for that, Donna. You've got a couple of trustees who are on this term, so any literature that can help to build our capacity is always super appreciated. If you'd be happy to share that with us, that would be great.
Okay.
The other question that I had, this document wasn't linked in the agenda, and I assume just because we hadn't received it yet. Are we able to get a copy of this, the trustees? The report that you've just presented.
Certainly, I thought we had provided it, but I'm not sure. Mo, if you want to circulate it to the trustees.
I think we sent it. We sent it in an email to the same document we sent.
Oh.
We have it.
Sorry, and is the public entitled to a copy of this document?
So we
We're
would.
in a public meeting right now, so it'll be in the minutes.
It'll be linked in the minutes if the public's interested. Okay, thank you.
It'll be in the agenda.
It's not linked to the agenda, no.
No, I just sent it as a standalone email to the trustees. So Donna, I wasn't sure because in the past,
Yeah,
I didn't do this. I just sent it as a standalone.
So typically we would actually do our reports in a closed meeting, like our detailed reports in a closed meeting versus an open meeting. And so I'm the public could, I think, request access through an FOI request, but typically it wouldn't be something that would be like posted or publicly circulated.
Okay.
Unless somebody asks for it.
Thank you.
Any other questions from trustees? Mo, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Donna and Nolan for coming in and presenting a very detailed audit plan, and also for being so flexible, because there's so many things coming up. There's COVID, there's a transition in secretary treasurer, there's basically just the whole challenges of having online audits, and the list goes on and on. So I wanted to just, the asset retirement obligation coming up. So, it's very unique times. And I want to just say thank you to Nolan and Donna for coming up with a very comprehensive plan that's also kind of living up to the high expectations that the Office of the Auditor General left. And that was one of the key things we were looking for as a finance committee, which was making sure that a lot of those services are being provided and some additional services maybe. So I want to just thank both of you, and we look forward to the audit and working with you guys. Thank you.
Yep. And on behalf of the board, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to present it to you.
Okay, board. The time is now 10 to 5. We're already 5 minutes over our into our break time. So we need to have a really quick discussion, and I'm going to look to staff again for advice on what we should do with the rest of this agenda.
I think we can probably leave you right now.
Yeah, you can.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Sorry, Rick, before we conclude, can I just, as part of the action items, this is probably prudent that we do this, that just the board approves the audit engagement plan as presented. It's probably prudent we do that because this is a board thing still.
Yep, that's fine. If someone is prepared to make that motion, which was to approve the audit plan as presented.
I am happy to make that motion.
And I'll second, Rick.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? And that's carried. Okay, Mo, Lisa, and anyone else who wants to wade in, what are we going to do with the rest of this agenda? Based on comments that I've had from previous meetings that went over, I think we better break awfully soon.
Let's finish the budget bylaw. That's the key. And then Indigenous.
Hi, everyone. It's Ian here. I have a very small agenda item, which is the annual facilities grant final draft. So it's virtually the same document you saw at the last meeting. There's one minor change at the bottom of it where we've added one more small project. Other than that, it's very similar. So it's there's nothing really new there. We're still within our spending limit, and we plan to get it's roughly 39 projects completed within our timeline, which is the end of March next year.
Great, thanks for that, Ian. And you need a motion passed. And I'm still just going to look back to senior staff to see if there are any concerns. It's not a major change to the agenda to change the order, so I'm not too worried about that.
No, as long as none of the trustees object.
Are there any objections to passing Ian's suggested motion on the AFG?
No.
Okay, Ian, do you want to make the motion? That is intent.
That the Finance Committee recommend the Board of Education approve the annual facilities grant as presented.
Thank you. Seconder for that, speak up. Somebody?
Yeah.
Was that Rebecca? Yep, thank you. Any discussion? All in favor? Okay, that's carried. Thank you. That gets that one out of the way. What about the rest of the agenda, Mo and Lisa?
So you have your public board meeting at 6 and dinner, let's say at 5, because we'll have a break at 5. What can you get through?
I think we should just quickly do the annual budget bylaw.
Okay.
Which I could get through that really quickly.
Okay, probably the annual budget bylaw if we could, Rick.
Okay. Mo, do you want to speak to that briefly, and then we'll,
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So if I could get everyone to open up the budget bylaw document, the actual budget bylaw, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share my screen if this doesn't take 1 hour for me to figure it out. You guys can see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
you're there.
Okay, so overall, I came back to the board in May 2021 when it comes to the first reading of the budget bylaw, which is all inclusive of everything that's finances going on in this district, and that's procedurally kind of the reason why I wanted the board to approve that first. But in reality, when I went to you guys in 2021, it was more, sorry, in May 2021, so last month, it was more to do with our operating revenues and our operating expenditures. Okay, so at that time, I said that I was going to come in to this board meeting with the second and third reading, which was basically going to be making the budget bylaw or the budget into more of a formal document, which is the budget bylaw that you guys see on the screen, along with accompanying infographics, and include in any changes that may have been made after the first reading was done, and also include in both our capital revenues and our capital expenditures. So overall, on statement 2, just going to go right over here. Okay, it explains what our total budgeted revenues, inclusive of capital and expenditures, consist of. So overall, the board, the budget bylaw will consist of a fully loaded $69.9 million or $70 million in revenues. And keep in mind that this includes capital amortization of $2.9 million. So that's basically recognizing the amortization of our buildings that are supported by the ministry, and then to offset the amortization expense, it's recognizing the revenues in addition to that. Okay, I know it's pretty complex, but very layman's terms, that's what that does. Overall, when it comes to our capital expenditures, it's a little bit higher than the revenues, and it consists of $71.9 million, which also includes in our capital expenditures. Okay, so overall, when it comes to our fully loaded capital expenses, they're further broken down on page 13 of this budget bylaw, right over here. Okay, and that basically walks the board through how much in revenues are we getting. That's also consisting of the deferred capital revenue I just talked about. And then basically it breaks down our capital expenditures. And then also our investment or our transfers basically to sustain our purchases for local capital. Okay, so overall, now I wanted to just quickly go over the rest of this document and just say that very high level, the rest of these supporting schedules and statements support that Schedule 2 that I talked about. Okay, so I want to just quickly touch on that. So Schedule 3 now is a breakdown. So just going down to Schedule 3. So Schedule 3 and all of its related schedules, so that's like 3A and 3B, further breaks down our operating revenues and expenditures. Okay, please note that this is not your special purpose funds in the form of the ministry template. The special purpose funds are further broken down into schedules. Just give me a second. Our special purpose funds are broken down into Schedule 2. Okay, so right over here, or sorry, Schedule 3. Okay, so Schedule 2 is your operating, Schedule 3 is your special purpose funds. Okay, and Schedule 4 is your budgeted capital revenues and expenditures. Right over here. Okay, so all of these basically tie into that first schedule that I talked about, which was basically the $70 million in revenues and $71 million in expenditures. Okay, so the next thing I quickly wanted to go over was what our operating revenues and our operating expenditures consist of when it comes to the infographics. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Okay, just give me a second, it's just loading up. Okay, so basically, this is a really nice infographics when it comes to getting that complex document and basically putting it in a form of where it's more of just a very summary document of how much operating revenues and expenses we have as a district. So overall, this is touching on, once again, that funding, fully loaded funding of $70 million that we have coming in. And it further breaks down that funding into the different components. So as you can see, majority of our funding, 60% of it, that $70 million is coming from enrollment funding, followed by an additional 11% coming from your special purpose funds, and another 11% coming from your unique student needs. Also, there's going to be a 2%, which we typically do of our surplus appropriation. So that's basically recognizing prior year surpluses into our next year budget that the board approves. The next portion of this infographics talks about that our FTE is 5,391 students. And basically why we've done that is because the FTE, for the most part, drives majority of where our funding is coming from when it comes to our enrollment funding and a lot of our special purpose funding, and also our international education funding too, for that matter. Okay, just note that the 5,391 FTE students is basically without international education, and that's not head count. This is saying that if you look in the bottom, we have estimated 5,000 headcount students generating 5,391 FTE. Okay, and just note that an FTE is essentially it's anything over 8 courses, and that's the reason why typically they calculate that FTE like that. So it's more impacting our secondary schools. And I think as a board, we could continue to see now why, if, for example, the province changed course-based funding to headcount-based funding, where it may have an impact on the school district's funding coming in, and therefore our ability to make decisions when it comes to expenditures in the future. The next slide, or the portion of this infographic, talks about our historical funding to expenditures and our resident FTE students over time. As you can see, since 2012-13 compared to 2021-22, we have went from 4,299 FTE to 5,391. And proportionally, as that's coming up, are both our revenues and our expenditures, which are identified in green, that being the revenues, and blue, that being the expenditures, have been going up year after year. Also, note that in 18-19, I think, or 17-18, one of those 2 years, we had such a significant bump up in our revenues and in our expenditures. It's because we had an increase in our special purpose funds, that being the classroom enhancement fund or the restored language. Okay, so just moving down. So the last part of this infographics now kind of breaks down what our operating budget expenditures look like. 56.2 million when it comes to salaries and benefits, or 84%, and 11.1 million, or 16%, when it comes to our resources. Our resources consist of our school supplies, services, transportation of students and other necessary expenses such as insurance and utilities. Almost the entire budget overall is non-discretionary, meaning that we have already allocated for specific needs, whether that's staffing or whether that's meeting our special purpose funds or whether that's meeting our collective agreements or the school act or the educational plan. Okay, so the below section of this infographics now basically breaks down what our operating expenditure looks like when it comes to objects or functions. So in reality, this is saying that $44.9 million or 66% is directly allocated towards schools. That's our site-based funding allocation model, per pupil funding allocation model that we have, plus a little bit more additional things. An additional $7.2 million or 11% is allocated towards our educational supports. What does that mean? That's going towards things like our itinerant teacher services, educational technology, our educational support program initiatives, and our Indigenous education portfolio. $9.2 million or 14% is allocated towards our maintenance and transportation. And an additional $5.8 million or 9% is allocated towards the district, which basically the breakdown is there's $2 million going towards our educational salaries that are in this office and other expenditures and supplies and services, etc. Additional $2 million going to our business services, which is things like HR and payroll and finance and all of our software, etc. that we do, and our various resource needs. An additional $1.4 million is going towards our international education, or 2%. Note that the international education department is completely self-sustaining for the most part on a year-to-year basis. That means that the revenues coming in are greater than the revenues greater than the expenditures, meaning that difference is basically put back into or reinvested into the school district in the form of various initiatives, whether it's additional FTE going towards our schools, or whether it's contributing to central office things such as our contingency or whatever. And then just small amounts going towards governance, $200,000, and our instructional leadership team, another $200,000. So overall, that's the second and third reading in different various forms and snapshots of our budget bylaw and what the school district's budget, spring budget consists of. And obviously, after the second and third reading, once again from the board has an opportunity to have or amend their budget going into the fall based on their actuals when it comes to both revenues and expenditures, which is all driven from our FTE actuals. So that's about it. And sorry, that's in my eyes, that was pretty quick. Probably not. But.
We'll be the judge of that. Thank you, Mo. Those graphics are brilliant, and they really do make it a lot clearer to people like me without a significant financial background. And I probably didn't need the word significant in that sentence. So I guess the next move would be to actually make that motion. Someone prepared to do that?
That the finance committee recommend the Board of Education approve the 2021-2022 annual budget as presented.
Great.
And I'll second that, Rick.
Okay, great. And is there any discussion on the motion?
Mo, just wondering quickly, I can see on the bar graph for 2020, 2021, 2021, 2022 that our expenditures look like they're a little bit higher than our funding. Is everything okay with that being that way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in reality, our funding is typically, over the last couple of years, or even going past, would be lower than our expenditures. And a lot of that comes from appropriating, and Ralph, you correct me if I'm wrong, it comes from the appropriation of our surplus too. So we're subsidizing it by supporting it through our contingency, whether it's internally restricted or our unallocated contingencies. So that's one of the reasons why we have that on a year-to-year basis. And it's typically, it's pretty normal, but Ralph, if you want to add on to that, if there was more of a technical reason, please add on.
Yeah, no more of a technical reason. It really is just that simple. We appropriate our surplus from the prior year, so our projected expenditures are higher than our anticipated revenue for next year, all based on that appropriated surplus.
Okay, any more questions before we have call a question? No, okay, all in favor? That's carried. That was everyone. Okay, now what are we? It's now almost 5:10. What are we doing with the rest of this? And we have, I want to recognize we have staff that have shown up to do other parts of this this agenda, but also trustees are going to be in meetings for another 2 or 3 hours after 6 o'clock. So they need a break.
Yeah, the budget bylaw got approved.
Yeah.
We have the surplus policy, which it's.
No, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
so, but so technically speaking, the targeted funding is part of your budget bylaw. So when you approve that, you have effectively approved your targeted funding. The Indigenous Education Council went through the targeted funding. I feel like that might have been yesterday or the day before. And I wonder, Rick, can we just give 30 seconds for Rebecca or Karen to say anything they might want to say?
Of course we can.
Well,
Thanks,
Rachel and I were both in attendance at that meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did
Rick,
you?
can anybody hear me?
Did you want?
Yep, we hear you, Rebecca.
Sorry, Rachel was also at that meeting. Sorry, Rachel.
Yeah. So we had 2 committee meetings prior to so that I could go through any questions and details about the budget, and then brought it to council. It all seems kind of familiar to other years. It's there weren't any real big questions about it, except there was one really great question that I managed to get clarified. And it was just as Lisa was expecting, there was a bit of money put towards helping support workers pay for their increased insurance. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that for Rebecca and Rachel, who were there at the meeting, because they know there was left with one question still to answer. So given that it was a pandemic year, the kind of outreach that support staff were supplying meant that they sometimes had to have an increase in their insurance to transport people or to do some of that work. Now I checked in with Susan, and she said she had spoken with Joy before, and whether that comes from targeted funds, and that was a yes.
Okay.
So that's about it. Everything else was, there weren't big questions.
Thanks.
or
Any
changes.
other questions or comments for Rachel and Rebecca for that matter? No, and I don't.
Yeah, it's Rebecca.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi, there must be a delay happening from my end. My internet's pretty slow, so I keep trying to speak. In any case, yes, the meeting was just yesterday, and the council members who were in attendance all agreed to the targeted fund budgets as presented, and passed a motion to that we recommend to the board that these be accepted. So that's, I guess that's all I have to add. I don't know if Rachel wants to kick in.
Anything, Rachel?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay. Thank you. And I think what Lisa was explaining was that we'd already passed this in the budget bylaw. So it sounds like, but I'm willing to be corrected. It sounds like we don't need another motion.
I know, I think it's part of the budget bylaw, but I think that we should make the motion so that there's record of it.
Yeah, I do think I think that would be a good idea.
Okay,
So I will say that the Finance Committee recommend the Board of Education approve the 2021-2022 Indigenous Education Targeted Funding Budget as presented.
thank you.
I'll second that.
Thanks very much. Any discussion? All in favor? That's carried. Thanks, Rachel and Rebecca, for your work on that, and of course, Karen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Karen.
All right. Been hopping around in this agenda, what have we missed? And
The only outstanding item is the accumulated operating surplus, and I'll be very brief. I'm not gonna be 25 minutes on this. I'll be like a minute, if you guys are okay.
Time them.
Yeah, okay, can I go?
go.
Yeah. Okay, so we have always had an accumulated operating surplus policy since 2018. We revised it in 2020. And the ministry, and Rick knows about this too, and passed down a communication when it comes to expectations of boards of educations having accumulated operating surplus policy. And it's going to come into play in the next school year, so the 21-22 school year. So what it did was I reconciled the communications that were passed down from the ministry onto the components an accumulated operating surplus policy should cover. And in reality, there's only one thing which was missing, which was in section 2.1, it's a third bullet point, and I added that in, which was contributing funds towards capital projects that are identified in board's 5-year capital plans and approved by the ministry. And that's it. And the funds are very small. It's like $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, but it's expectation from the ministry that happens if a major capital project is approved, like a new school or an expansion or something. And basically that's the only component that's missing. So the next steps are, if the board does pass this revised policy today, with that additional bullet point added, I will be basically in probably the summertime sending the ministry a revised policy, because there's the requirement that the boards send a revised or a new policy over to the ministry so they could verify it.
So is there a motion with this policy 704?
So I'm making the motion right now, or I'm recommending the motion that the board approve the amended policy 704 accumulated operating surplus with the changes identified. That's
Okay.
the motion.
Thanks. Is there someone prepared to make that motion?
Or sorry, the committee of the whole recommends that the board, approves. Sorry about that.
It's the finance committee, I think.
Yeah, okay.
I would make that motion.
Thank you. Seconder?
Rebecca?
Thanks, Celeste. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? Okay, that's carried. Is there any business left on the agenda?
Not that I can see.
All right. Having completed the business on the agenda, and if there are no objections from trustees, I'm going to declare the meeting of the Finance Committee adjourned, and we'll see everybody at 6 o'clock for the public meeting.
You bet.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, just give me 1 second, just exit the meeting.
Let's